Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I hope you find it as interesting as we do, and we are really happy to welcome you, as always, Jesse Bragg from Corporate Accountability. Hi, Jesse, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
So we have Jesse today because Corporate Accountability with us, a group of partners released a really interesting report, and we know that many of you will be going to COP or will be writing from COP or these things, and we thought that you would like to have this information beforehand. So broadly, Jesse, what is all this report about?
So this report I have in front of me, it may be backwards, but Polluting Paris takes our campaign that we've been running for a few years now around identifying the interests at the UNFCCC that are corrupting the process. The campaign's been called "Kick Big Polluters Out." It takes it to the next logical step, which is looking specifically at those realms of the negotiations where damage is being done and where the greatest risks are. And so this report really looks at two different areas. One is, what are the forces that are allowing this to happen? So taking a look at the US and the European Union, as well as sponsorship of these meetings, what that does, and the observer participation issue that's been going on for some time around like who can be at the table and who shouldn't. And then it also looks at areas of the negotiations. So it's specifically Article 6, agriculture, technology, and the Green Climate Fund, and concludes that, of course, there is damage being done, and we're actually kind of at this crossroads right now, where if we don't make some big changes to our approaches, we could lock ourselves into a scenario where the Paris Agreement becomes mostly a money-making scheme for some of the world's largest corporations, and does not reach its potential to cut emissions and stave off the worst effects of climate change.
Well, so I guess we have very important work to do during this COP and the coming one. Just for everybody who is listening to us, remember that after I ask some questions to Jesse and we have a bit of a discussion, you can also ask questions. So if you look at so you're now looking at the YouTube screen, and on your right hand, there's a live chat. You can just comment there and I will be reading the questions later. But let's jump into it. The first thing you talk about when you talk about the report is about big polluters being in the UNFCCC and like the conflict of interest that this supposes. So what is it about? Can you give us some examples as well?
Sure. Yeah, this is an issue that we really started to bring up about 2 years ago, and the last intersessional negotiation at the UNFCCC in May 2017, it really rose to a new level of importance in the negotiations. And the real issue at hand is there are no rules right now that can help decide which groups are here to help the advancement of this treaty versus which groups are here at the UNFCCC to slow it down or to block certain policies or redirect the negotiations toward their financial interests. And in particular, our concerns stem from a lot of the fossil fuel industry trade associations who are part of the negotiations as business industry NGOs. So those include the US Chamber of Commerce, for example, or Business Europe, the World Coal Association, the Competitive Enterprise Institute. These are groups that are known around the world to advance the interests of the fossil fuel industry. And some of them have even said that they don't support the Paris Agreement. They think the Paris Agreement's too ambitious, or it's unfair to business or global north countries. And so the question is, what role do they play in these talks? And delegates really took that issue on last May, and we'll be continuing to discuss it next May. But it's fundamentally who should be at the negotiating table. Should powerful industry groups representing corporations that whose revenue dwarfs the GDP of many of the countries at the negotiating table. Should they be allowed to slow down the process? Do they really have a credible voice in climate policy making, or should we find a way to make sure they're not influencing the agreement any longer?
Okay, and I guess that's the solution that you also propose, or one of the possible ones, to maybe define what are the people doing here?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll just actually pull forward exactly what it says in the report. But there's a really basic legal framework around conflicts of interest that most large entities have a policy around. And really what it comes down to is arriving at a shared understanding of what the words conflict of interest mean in the context of the UNFCCC, and then shaping a policy around it that protects the integrity of the talks and protects the objectives of the treaty from the influence of those that are trying to derail the process. If we're able to do that, it will go a long way in protecting many of the other topic areas that we'll talk about today, making sure that those that are at the table are there for the climate and for people and not to advance their financial interests.
Thanks, Jesse. I see that in your report as well, you mentioned the influence of these corporations specifically on Article 6, which is about carbon markets. So do we have idea on how do they do that, if they are negotiating about these to fight this as well?
Well, the interesting thing about Article 6 is while the negotiations have really focused on carbon markets, and a lot of the talk has been around how are we going to create maybe a global carbon market. That's not all that's in that article. And in fact, developing countries fought tooth and nail to include provisions around non-market approaches to cooperation. And those aspects, that concept has been largely ignored by the negotiations, and you can look exactly at who's at the table to find out why. The International Emissions Trading Association, who counts its members, it's a great lineup of big polluters. BP, Rio Tinto, Chevron, BHP, Dow, goes on and on. The internet, they are really, really entrenched in these talks. So entrenched, in fact, that there are actually some delegates. There's one delegate in particular who serves on their board and is also serving on a delegation on behalf of a government. And so it's no wonder that when we think about Article 6, we think, oh, carbon markets, that's what that article is all about. That's part of it, but we need to give space to the other concepts. And that's never going to happen if those most interested in advancing, in putting a price on carbon and creating a market around it, are the ones at the table. We saw what happened in the European Union when the process around the EU's carbon trading market was captured by the industry. It failed to cut emissions. And so if that's going to be our only focus for emissions reduction, and we're letting the industry capture it, how do we expect a different result this time around? So that's one of the primary points that this section makes, and it calls for a second look at carbon markets as the end-all be-all to the climate crisis. We all know that emissions regulations work best, and so we need to take a look at all of the solutions and not let industry drive us toward the ones that benefit them the most.
Thanks, Jesse. And I find this language issue very interesting because actually myself, when I think about Article 6, I think about carbon markets.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something that I need to transmit as well whenever we do trainings and stuff. Like, we cannot let Article 6 to be only that, because we are losing the battle directly. Then
Right.
Really interesting. And then you also talk about another different type of influence of these corporations, which is through sponsorship. So I know we have different examples of what this means and what happened in other COPs. Maybe you can explain our audience.
Sure, yeah, and this is a section that was authored by Pasco Sabito from Corporate Europe Observatory, which is based in Brussels. If you haven't heard of them, you should really look at them. They just actually released a report on the capture of the EU by gas corporations and the gas lobby. Very interesting report. This has been an issue for a long time. I think that it really rose up in a lot of people's that follow this process, rose up for a lot of people around COP19 in Warsaw. You had the negotiations took place in a football stadium turned into a conference center, and they had logos of PGE and Lotus. Both are state-owned coal and oil companies. And that's actually the COP where there was a civil society walkout, because there was also this parallel conference that the head of the secretariat at the time spoke at, that was run by the World Coal Association. But fundamentally what we're talking about here is corporations paying to sponsor the talks, which on the surface is something we're very used to this day and age. Everything's sponsored by some brand. But when it gets really harmful, it happens in two ways. One, that sponsorship allows them access to the branding of the UNFCCC and the COP itself. And so that allows otherwise very dirty corporations to greenwash their image and appear to be part of the solution. And so you may see a corporation spend more advertising the fact that they're sponsoring a COP than they actually are spending on that sponsorship, because it has such value to them for their brand. And then the second thing is that sponsorship can actually buy them access. Private corporations are not allowed direct access to the negotiations. You can't, ExxonMobil can't get directly accredited to be an observer to the talks. But if a private corporation sponsors the talks, there have been cases in which that buys them access to negotiators, gets them access to rooms that negotiators are meeting in. And that becomes very, very problematic when you can buy preferential treatment in this process that's supposed to be about global cooperation and arriving at a global solution. That's going to skew the results of the negotiations, undoubtedly. That's why these corporations will pay for it. And so the recommendations that Sabito makes are we need to create a system in which member states are funding this directly and doing it, proportionally to their historical responsibility to this crisis. We can't turn to the private sector to pay for this. We need to turn to those most responsible to pay for this. And that means global North countries need to fork over more cash to make sure these meetings are happening. And the burden cannot fall on developing countries to fund these meetings.
Thanks, Jesse. That's very interesting. And I'm sure people will be looking forward to see about who sponsors this COP and the next one as well. And now that you're mentioning buying your way into the negotiations, you also speak of the case of the Green Climate Fund in the report, and how corporations are influencing the decision making. Maybe you could give some examples so people understand what's the Green Climate Fund and how corporations are actually doing something there.
Sure. Yeah, so this chapter is really interesting, and it was authored by Liddy Nakpil of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. They're based in the Philippines. And, the Green Climate Fund is the mechanism that was set up to allow for transfer of funds from global North countries, or in UNFCCC language, developed countries, to developing countries, to facilitate and fund the transition to renewables or other solutions. And it's no secret, so far the Green Climate Fund is woefully underfunded. But it's a whole sort of separate process wherein projects and financial institutions need to be accredited to participate, to either help to handle the money as it's allocated or to run projects in certain countries. And that's where problem number one has arisen. The Green Climate Fund has accredited large institutions and development banks, as well as transnational banks themselves, that are also funding major fossil fuel projects. And so there's a direct conflict there, where they're making money off of expanding, coal projects or oil projects, and at the same time helping to handle and dole out the money that's supposed to transition away from those projects that they're making money off of. There's no way that that institution can do both in good faith. And so that's one of the first things that Knockfield brings forward in this. And then the second is around observers. Observers have been more and more stifled in their expression during the Green Climate Fund negotiations, to the point where I believe she talks about at the July 2017 board meeting for the Green Climate Fund, civil society was silenced completely, and they were speaking out against exactly that, the unbalanced accreditation of big transnational banks and development institutions. And then the last thing she brings forward is the imbalance of private sector versus public projects that have been funded thus far. If you add up all the numbers based on her analysis, while 17 out of 54 projects are private, which doesn't seem that bad at first, $1.74 billion has been allocated to those private projects versus only $1.3 billion to the public projects. And so you can see the scale of the private projects is much larger. Much more of the GCF's funds are going toward a smaller number of private projects, and that is very problematic, because the solution, as we see it, as Knockfield sees it, is in community-based and community-determined projects. It's not in large-scale, World Bank or Asian Development Bank-esque projects that can displace people and have a number of negative outcomes. So the GCF has some reckoning to do with what its outcomes need to be versus what its policies have been thus far, and its almost favoritism toward the private sector to accomplish these goals.
Incredible. And the fact that they silenced the civil society in the negotiations of this July, it's very worrying, and I hope it doesn't go further in the coming negotiations on that. Does she recommend any specific solutions we should be commenting on?
Yes, there are a number here. The first is to create a policy within the Green Climate Fund that keeps banks and entities with conflicts of interest from being accredited. Simply put, if you're funding a coal project, you can't also be funding a renewable project with the GCF money, because you can't profit from the crisis and then pretend to try to solve it at the same time. The creation of an exclusion policy that will prevent GCF funds from being used on fossil fuel projects. That's really important, and it's not part of the GCF's policies currently. Fully transparent and rigorous scrutiny of applicants for accreditation to the GCF and of project proposals being submitted for funding. Strengthening of the accountability mechanisms. So private banks must be held to the highest level of accountability in terms of financing and implementation of the projects. And then stronger and more vigorous implementation of the GCF principles and policies on direct access by Global South countries and in participation of civil society, indigenous people, and other communities and constituencies who have been shut out of the process. putting those together will mean that not only the GCF is more accountable and is reducing the conflicts of interest within its operations, but it's giving the voice to the right people. It's not big banks that are going to solve this crisis. It's people determining what's best for their communities. And so we need to take a harder look at how we're accessing those people with the expertise and driving funds toward their priorities.
Thanks, Jesse. It's a technical issue, like a very, maybe more complicated to understand, but it's really interesting, and I hope people are following that. If not, of course, you all can read the report. And finally, I'm really excited about your agriculture section, because it's really interesting to see how corporations also influence that. So maybe you can explain how agriculture policy is being influenced by these organizations.
Sure. Yeah, it is really interesting because, you know, it's not, agriculture isn't something that makes a lot of headlines in terms of climate policy at the UNFCCC, but there's this term climate smart agriculture that has become a buzzword in the negotiations. It was originally developed by the Food and Agriculture Organization at the UN, but it didn't really have a strict definition. And so that buzzword, or those buzzwords, have been co-opted by transnational agricultural corporations. And so they've used that to, in a way, greenwash their industrial agricultural practices. And so that's, you know, synthetic fertilizer use, that's, you know, large scale factory farming, and using buzzwords like climate smart makes it sound like, oh, there must be something different about these practices that makes them green. But in reality, there's not much behind that term. And so what the author of this chapter, by the way, is Teresa Anderson from ActionAid International. And what she draws forward is that we need to have a stricter definition of that term, or do away with it, because the agricultural practices that are going to reduce emissions and make food more available and secure for people are not factory farming or industrial agricultural practices, because those can lead to, you know, monocrop culture, which means people are planting one strain of a crop in large scale, which makes them very vulnerable to some sort of disease wiping out the entire crop. There are a number of agricultural practices that I'm not as familiar with that Anderson is, that not only can provide food for the world, but do it in a way that doesn't harm the environment and open us up to food, like risks of scarcity and other challenges. And just a couple examples that she's pulled forward in her section, beyond the climate smart agriculture example, is just sort of the commonplace participation from some of the world's largest agricultural corporations. So Yara, which is one of the world's largest fertilizer companies, has been lobbying at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization for some time, and has actually taken leadership roles there. They hold side events at UNFCCC meetings, where they push this climate smart agriculture concept and also the benefits of synthetic fertilizers, and try to steer the negotiations toward their business model. Last May, May 2017, agribusinesses like Syngenta and Olam touted their own company's efforts as ambitious mitigation actions, and which, you know, was nothing more than just greenwashing, but it happened in a formal UNFCCC setting. Monsanto, which is often a corporate villain here in the US, is a leading producer of herbicides and genetically modified seeds. They also co-chair the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, their climate smart agriculture working group. And they use that forum to push their products and their business as the solution. And so they're really these corporations and the trade associations that represent them have really successfully shifted the conversation toward practices that benefit their business model, that and certainly do not by any measure benefit the environment or people involved in the food supply chain. So the recommendations she makes are twofold: developing recommendations and policies that promote agroecological farming practices, which both strengthen the adaptation and resilience of food systems to climate change and also benefit farmers, the environment, and people more broadly. So that's the shifting our food system away from industrial agriculture toward smaller scale, more sustainable practices, and regulate and reduce non-CO2 emissions from industrialized farming systems in order to transition away from those the industry's reliance on synthetic fertilizers and other climate harming products. The industry has been very adept at avoiding regulation of non-CO2 emissions in their practices. And so that has a number of environmental impacts, and it also has a number of sort of long-term impacts on the land and the ability to continue to farm from it. So that's a quick recap of her section, and certainly I'm not doing it quite justice the way that she would as an expert in agriculture, but it's a really interesting area that needs to get more attention, because obviously not only is food necessary for life, but it is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. And so we need to find a way to reconcile the need to expand food production, but do it in a way that doesn't continue to harm the environment.
Thanks, Jesse. And for sure, you gave a good summary, so don't worry. People can go further in the report if they need.
Yeah.
We were talking as well that there were some concrete examples of some countries. So maybe since you're based in the US, maybe you could explain some of the Trump situation and how do you see it in this report?
Well, the interesting, the interesting isn't quite the right word, because it's more depressing from our perspective, but the Trump administration doesn't represent really a shift in the US's approach to climate policy outside of wanting to exit the Paris Agreement. The US has long undermined the negotiations toward its economic interests and the interests of the industries, whether it's fossil fuel or otherwise at home. What the Trump administration is the most blatant, almost to an unprecedented level, capture of the federal government by the fossil fuel industry. I mean, the number of either administration officials that Donald Trump has appointed that have deep investments in the fossil fuel industry, or used to work for the fossil fuel industry, or have just taken enormous amounts of money from the fossil fuel industry is somewhat unprecedented for the US. And so the US has long served as a facilitator to the interference and influence of transnational corporations and industries more broadly. And so we expect that to continue. We expect that the Trump administration will stay involved in these talks, if for no other reason than to continue to hold the door open for the very industries that are driving this crisis. And we know they're going to do that because they've already started doing that at home. In the US, they've rolled back more than 50 environmental regulations, equaling about 3/4 of the US's commitment to cut emissions before 2025. So, you know, they're gutting our climate action at home, and at the same time, they're keeping their foot in the door at the UNFCCC so that their friends can sneak through and continue to undermine the talks there. And the other thing is that as our colleague Pasco at Corporate Europe Observatory points out, the EU is up to the same tricks. While the EU may be a little bit better on climate policy than the US, especially lately, they benefit from that reputation. At the same time, they've taken numerous actions to undermine climate action, both at home and within the UNFCCC, at the behest of the industries that the likes of Business Europe and others represent. And so the global community, and especially delegates from the Global South who are arriving at these meetings, probably about a week ago, and really trying to get something profound done for their countries, they need to see, especially the US, for what it is now. The US is a bad faith negotiator. They've said they want to get out of Paris. They've gutted almost every component of their commitment to the Paris Agreement, yet they want to continue to be part of the talks. So we need to be asking ourselves, what role do they play here besides just undermining and delaying? That's the role they've played for a long time. And now it's just so obvious and blatant that we really can't allow it to continue on this way.
Yeah, it's like the facade is gone right now.
Exactly.
And I actually wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah.
So why do you think this report will be important towards COP23, and what can we expect to happen there for those who are following the negotiations?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Outside of just bringing these issues up and hopefully creating a more deep conversation around the solutions that are really going to get us out of this, or stave off the worst of this crisis. The big thing on the horizon for the UNFCCC is the development of the modalities, guidelines, or procedures and guidelines for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, the MPGs. And parties gave themselves a deadline of COP24 to agree to those MPGs. And if we're not careful, those MPGs, if they're influenced by the industry or by global north countries, they could in effect only allow components of the Paris Agreement that the industry is in favor of to really be implemented. Sort of cherry picking from the agreement what is most advantageous for the industry. So if you think about Article 6 for a second, if the guidelines that are developed only address how to implement carbon markets, but don't give any nod to or develop out guidelines or to other non-market approaches, then the only thing we're going to advance is carbon markets. So there's a lot of concern right now in the development of these MPGs that we could in effect start to renegotiate the Paris Agreement, or really narrow it down to just those issues and those components that global north countries are in favor of and the industries that those countries represent. So that's the big thing to watch at COP24. And our hope is that this report can bring some of those issues to the forefront for negotiators so that they're looking for them as the negotiations move forward.
Thanks, Jesse. That's really interesting. And I guess my final comment would be, if you want to give any final overall conclusion or something like this before we move to questions.
I will keep it brief. I do want to just make clear that there are a number of experts that I encourage everyone I can connect people to if they want to dig in a little bit more deeply on some of these issues, or if they want to get direct quotes from those individuals. They are the reason that this report came together. There's another section that we didn't talk about on technology by Neth Daniel from ETC Group. That's erosion working group on erosion technology and concentration. And so please do not be shy about reaching out and trying to get connected to these people. And I actually have their contact information that I can send around if you want to just reach out to them directly.
Great, thanks, Jesse. So I will read you a couple of questions that we have from people watching the webinar.
Sure.
The first one is from Raki from India. Raki says that for sure China is phasing out coal within the borders of the country, but she's seeing how they are exporting technology and train manpower as aid abroad or things like this. So she asked if you have any idea of how such actions could be curbed and addressed for proper climate action.
It's a great question, and that is something that NEF in the technology section of the report addresses to some extent. That is the real risk right now, is that the mechanisms that are set up for technology transfer have been more or less captured by major fossil fuel trade associations and corporations themselves, which will result in exactly that. While China may be phasing out coal at home, there's a risk that countries can, and I know Japan has done this, just ramp up the development of coal outside of their borders. And that if this process is captured, we're going to be transferring fossil fuel technology in place of renewable solutions. And so I encourage you to read the technology section. I'm just going to pull it up, but I'm certainly no expert here. But what NEF puts forward is to institutionalize the evaluation of potential environmental, social, and economic impacts of climate technologies promoted through that technology mechanism. Make a more stringent vetting process for the types of technology that are transferred through the mechanism. And conduct a current review of the non-state actors involved in the operation of the technology mechanism to address potential conflicts of interest. There's no mechanism there to say, oh wait, you are a coal corporation or a coal industry group. You have no place in the technology mechanism. And then finally, prioritize the promotion of and support for technologies and innovations developed by local communities for climate adaptation and mitigation. There's a risk that we're going to only advance large scale projects, whether they be fossil fuel or more green. At one point, an ally of ours equated it to arguing in favor of installing phone lines across areas that don't have access to phones right now, instead of making sure that there's mobile phone access. We don't need to install centralized energy solutions in every case. We need to look to the communities to determine what makes most sense for them and for their goals and development, and let them lead. And so if the technology mechanism can start to move down that road, we can avoid examples like what you just brought forward, where the transfer that's happening is not only fossil fuel driven, but it's large scale. Both of those are going to be problematic if we're going to really, truly transition to a just and renewable future.
Definitely. Thanks, Jesse. And we have another question from Elif from Turkey. She asks if it's possible that the Green Climate funds come only from governments, or if it has to also come from the private sector.
That's a really good question. I'm not as familiar. I believe, my understanding is that the original intent of the Green Climate Fund was for finance transferred from Global North countries to Global South countries in order to facilitate that transfer. I think there is a risk that it could be more and more financed privately, but I'm not sure if they've gotten there yet. That's a really great question for Liddy, and I'd be happy to connect you directly with Liddy.
Of course, thanks. I'm sure she will be very happy to do that. And I have the last question for now, and I think it may be the last one of this webinar. We have Arthur asking if there are worries about the COP sponsorship for this year, for the Fiji COP, and also for the next year Polish COP.
Well, we've seen what a Polish COP looks like with most recently COP19. So I think there are definitely concerns with what that's going to look like, especially because this COP24 will be in the heart of not only Polish coal country, but the center of Europe's coal production in Poland. In terms of this COP, we haven't seen as much. Oftentimes we have to wait until we get there to see exactly what the sponsorship looks like. I think COP21 in Paris, there was a lot of concern, a lot of media around who was sponsoring the COP. And that may have been because they advertised who was sponsoring it far in advance of the meeting. And that kind of backfired for them. And so what we saw at COP22 was a little bit less advance notice on who the sponsors were. And so we kind of expect the same thing to happen for COP23. But we do anticipate that there will be major corporations with ties to the fossil fuel industry or that depend on the fossil fuel industry. I think there's been some talk around an airline sponsoring the COP. Those sort of things we'll be monitoring, and we'll definitely share with the tracker team as soon as we get more information.
Of course, I'm sure the online community suddenly will see a lot of tweeting and stuff against corporate capture of the COP. So that's great.
Right.
So that's all for now, Jesse. Thanks so much. We are really looking forward to seeing all of this at COP as well, and how it develops, how you present as well the report and so on. And definitely I will make sure that if any of you who are watching this webinar, either now or later on, because it will be on YouTube, if you have any questions, please email Climate Tracker. We can put you in touch with Jesse and the experts of the report to help you publish your articles.
Great.
Yeah, so thanks, Jesse, for being here, for spending some time with us. Congratulations again on the report, and yeah, see you soon.
Thanks so much for having me, and yeah, looking forward to seeing everyone next week in Germany. Bring warm clothes.
Exactly. Thanks, Jesse. Bye-bye, everyone.